And we are live, Ryan Ray, alongside the good doctor, Ellen Wald. It is Injury Podcast episode, I never say it on here, it's like episode 140. I have it on the thing. I can't see it. That makes me
142.
142. Thank you. 142 episodes in. Dr. Wald, how is it going? The last Monday of January. January's kind of flown by for a weird 2021.
Yeah, I'm a little I'm like I have to check. Is it really the last Monday? Yeah, it is next week, February 1st. And February is the shortest month of the year.
And so the question now is it bad that when crazy stuff is happening, time still feels like it's moving fast? Because last year, crazy stuff was happening. It felt like time was at a screeching halt. Are we just so used to this crazy world now that's like, yeah, okay, whatever, things are happening, and we're just steamrolling through? Because it feels like we're back to a normal pace year, which is considered as weird. So
I don't know. I kind of felt like in the first half of today, I'd experienced an entire week, and I'm like ready for the weekend again. So,
well, this is my third show today, so it's I'll be feeling it by the end of this one. So yeah, we'll get there. Consummate professional. I know they say consummate professional. Okay, Miss Wald, we've got a lot to get to, and we have a guest, so let's get to it. Big old hits breaks on search for new fossil fuels. I thought of this in the movie Beauty and the Beast, right? This is kind of one of those
yes.
song as old as rhyme. When prices are down, they quit looking for oil. Like this is kind of what this is, right? But I mean, I think if you go back in the archive, 100 and some episodes, we probably talked about this version of the story, whether they were increasing their budget, they're decreasing their budget. We're gonna run out of oil, and like it. This is just rinse and repeat story. I think Reuters and these people just have these stories on tap to roll out, right?
Yeah, I think they do. I think, though, it's kind of interesting to look at the comparison between the different companies here. So of the 5 companies, BP saw by far the largest drop in new acreage acquisition in 2020, which I guess goes along with their strategy to no longer be an oil company.
Yeah, that makes
right?
sense. Right. Yeah, that works for them.
Right? In order to pursue their goal of not being an oil company, they should not drill for oil.
Yes, I'm following you there, 100%.
Yeah. So that works. Okay, so Exxon acquired the least acreage in 2020 in the group with 63% in 3 blocks in Angola. Total also got 2 blocks in Angola and Oman. So I think it's a little interesting also to see where they are acquiring, where they're going for their new energy sources. I think it also, I remember back in, I don't actually remember what year, but there was that the Calgary Stampede where they talk about bull riding and energy, I guess. And the energy minister from the UAE was there, and he was going on about how this is a huge problem that people aren't investing, and they're clearly here just looking at the big oil companies, but who is still investing? The UAE, big time. They're the only company I think that hasn't cut capex.
Yeah, well, I mean, we talked about them on the show last week, right? That was was it their oil company we talked about?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
So
they're
I
a
think
real
they're a company to keep an eye on.
yeah, and I just thought I need to address it real quick before we get started in the show, and I forgot. Someone's been asking me about will we keep doing the show on, I don't know if it's on the show, but will we keep doing these shows on Twitter, Periscope? Periscope is closing down at the end of March. My understanding is that they will just do Twitter live, and so as soon as we get that, we don't have the hookups here. So just for those of you who do watch the show live, it just will move to Twitter whenever they send out how to get. We'll be on Twitter live. So just as a heads up for those who have been asking about where the show will be, we actually get pretty good viewers on the show. So the comments are open. If you're on here, let us know. Okay, let's talk about this one. U.S. oil refiners set for worst earnings quarter of the pandemic. That's impressive that it took all the way to 2021, right? Okay, it's that all things considered.
Hey.
Yeah. So, what do you think, Ms. Wald? What do you make of this story?
So, I mean, I think it's both. Look, oil refineries have definitely been under a lot of pressure. I can barely read this article because there's a huge ad for Barclays in the way. Okay, there we go. Finally went away. But yeah, look, they're gonna have bad fourth quarter earnings, bad jet fuel, bad, gasoline's getting better, but it's still not great. But what's kind of interesting is that I mean, they say like consumption of liquid fuels globally has fallen by 9 million barrels a day in 2020. But remember what we heard from Dr. Foreman, which is that we're seeing kind of a shift in the way that crude oil is being utilized in the United States, and that refineries are shifting away from fuels that aren't, being utilized as much, like jet fuel and stuff, and they're producing more things that can be used for petrochemicals. And so I wonder if, we'll see if they will continue with this shift, if they'll say like, hey, that's the way we need to go, or if they'll just kind of like eat the bad years and hope that it gets better.
Yeah, I think I was watching Mark Rosano the other day talking about some of the movements that he's seen. I think you saw the story last week. Maybe you commented on it or shared it or something about U-Haul was showing all the data for the company, where people were moving to, and obviously you have some givens, these states here, these states there, da da da. But it's not just simply someone moving from one state to another. When you think about like gasoline demand, if you live in Dallas Fort Worth, there's really two ways that can pan out. You could literally be 5 minutes from everything that you want, your work, your grocery stores, all that stuff, or you could be an hour away, right? So when you move from a big city to a more rural spot, then you might increase demand or decrease demand. So demand and how we see it in the U.S. is going to take a little while to kind of recalibrate, I would think, to figure out where things are going. And then the other thing is, what do you think about the flights? I talked to someone the other day. They said that from what they're seeing, they still haven't really picked back up that much. I mean, it's picked up, but it's not where it should be. And when you look at kind of that demand, it's will that come back? The Biden administration 14-day quarantine deal. Is that what it is?
You have to produce a negative test to get into the U.S. now. It's the UK that's making everyone quarantine when they arrive.
Okay. Yeah. That's what it is. Okay.
And Germany, by the way, so apparently Lufthansa, you have to wear a medical mask on their plane, and Austrian Airlines, which I think I actually did fly once, you have to wear an N95 mask.
Do they provide that? Is that
that was not clear.
I talked to a guy the other day, and he was.
Did they provide it? Did they fit it? I mean, these things are not supposed to actually be effective unless they're fitted by a professional. So,
right. I talked to a guy the other day, and he was saying that he flew from somewhere. It was like 2 9-hour flights plus his 2-hour flight home, 18 hours with the mask on. I know. I could imagine. I could not imagine. Okay. But yeah, I think the refining story is still yet to be told, right? We've got a long way. And then, how will the Keystone stuff impact this, you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's weird because you get this weird dichotomy between people who are like, they killed jobs, and well, the Keystone wasn't really useful. Like anyway, there were other things. Everything was better. This thing was dead anyway. And that's one of the questions I really want to ask our guest who's coming on later. His thoughts on, was this really a dead project? Because I was under the impression that it was going and it was going to be utilized. And so I'm not really sure like why people were saying it's dead, if that's just like it was already dead. If that's just something that they're saying either to like basically like say, oh, it's okay that you did it because it was dead already. And because I don't see a lot of justification in terms of evidence there. So
yeah, I mean, I don't think it's okay you did it, period. If it was dead or wasn't dead, I don't think that's even. I think that should be relevant to the discussion. I know what you're saying, that some people could justify it by saying, well, it was dead, doesn't matter. I think there's precedent. And I wrote a piece about this, about the precedent that we see with these executive orders. And, it's interesting that you're phrasing it from a job standpoint. I'd like to phrase it as, I can't sell my property to someone's standpoint. And how there's implications there that the federal government is saying that you can't, sell your property. And the federal government, if you go back to look at it, historical things, is not uncommon to act in this manner. But you're right. It's interesting. Everyone has their own take on this project. And I had someone email me the other day and they said that they thought this might be a net benefit for U.S. producers because they're taking those barrels. And I thought, well, right?
Sorry, could you say that again? You kind of faded out there.
Yeah, that's a different type of oil that we needed, that we're getting from from Canada. We can't produce that, so.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, Dr. Foreman did say that the U.S. refineries are utilizing a lot more of the type of oil that we produce domestically now, but that doesn't mean that there isn't still demand for heavy oil like Western, like WCS that they produce in Alberta. And I think that a lot of people don't really have a good sense of actually how intertwined the oil economies of the United States and Canada really are. I mean, we're sending oil back and forth between Canada and the United States all the time. Oil products, everything. It's very intertwined as it is, and this was only going to ease the burden that we've placed, I think, on, first of all, some pipelines, but also on rail systems. So it wasn't just like a nice thing that we were doing for Canada. Our energy ecosystems are very much entwined with Canada. Like, people are like, oh, US energy independence. No, it's like, if you want to talk about North American energy independence, then maybe we could talk, because Canada is a really important part of that. And I think until people see Canada as, really understand what an integral role Canada does play, they're not going to understand why the Keystone XL pipeline was, proposed and was seen as valuable.
Okay, speaking of the Biden administration, they suspended federal leasing and permitting. Now, this is a 60-day temporary, at least for now, temporary ban or ceasing. And so any existing activity or whatever is free to continue. But if you want to do something new, that's where the problem is. So here's my question to you, Ms. Paul. We have Keystone XL, which was kind of the easy target. That's the low-hanging fruit. I think Biden could do that without a lot of blowback. Yes, there's jobs lost and all this stuff. But as you say, it's we've been working on this thing for a long time. And so I think it's just the political capital expended. There's not much. The fracking stuff that we saw is 60 days, is temporary, and he wants to get in his new Department of Interior or whatever guy. So is this something that 60 days from now, or whatever it is, 57 days now, I guess, that the Biden administration will go, okay, you know what? We got our guy in, we're ready to roll? Or is this laying down the foundation for more stringent regulation on federal land?
Oh, absolutely. This is just the beginning of more stringent regulations on federal land. This is like, I think this is to see what they can get away with. If people don't make a big deal about this, then they could just continue it forever. And New Mexico will like pound their door down saying, like, we have no money now. But do they really care about New Mexico?
Well, New Mexico asked for this because they voted for Biden. So,
well, that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. But it just reminds, like, I remember that the campaign, and when there was a video of Biden being like, "I'm absolutely going to ban fracking," and it was like, "No ban on fracking, no ban on fracking." It's like, I mean, come on, guys. Everybody knew this was a one thing that they really had the ability to do. They were definitely going to do it. If you were living in New Mexico and you thought that you were not going to face this, then like you're joking. Like, you were kidding yourself.
I think the problem is a couple-fold. One, if you look at who voted for Trump and who voted for Biden in New Mexico, you'll see that the people in the federal lands area voted for Trump, right?
So, I would say most likely, but it's also
if you look at the map, like the Southeast, it's definitely Trump voters, and so the Santa Fe Albuquerque area, that's Biden voters, and so it's weird because you have, do those people in Santa Fe and Albuquerque actually understand that they're voting to hurt their state? And in Mexico, we follow this on the Texas Oil and Gas podcast. Their government has come out at various times and said conflicting things about oil and gas. It's almost as if they don't have a consistent message on what they want, from the governor down to promote. And so, and then at the end of the day, it's federal lands. It's like, okay, even if New Mexico would have voted for Trump, he would have lost. Still wouldn't change the election, but you still would have federal lands that are disproportionately impacting a state's economy because of all the money they're bringing in. So,
yeah, I mean, I think that's it. It's that. So one of the interesting things is, if you look at how Pennsylvania distributes the money that they get, the state gets from fracking, and most of the fracking is done in areas that don't receive most of the benefit for the funds, right? Like, most of the money goes to cities and those areas, not like out in Marcellus shale areas, which does, I mean, make sense, because more people live in the cities, right? I
Right.
mean, all the money's going to the state, and the state is distributing it based on who's clamoring loudly for it. And I'm sure that Philadelphia is clamoring very, very loudly for it, and that's where a lot of voters are. So I understand that, but like, I mean, it just seems, but that's also places that are most likely to vote against
Right.
fracking.
Right.
So they're getting most of the money, and yet they're the ones taking stands against it. I just wish they would realize that. Maybe they don't want the money. Hey, fine. But
So the concern I have here is if Biden comes back 60 days from now and they roll out regulations. It's not so that they give permit. They'll allow new permits, but they'll roll out regulations, and that applies to anything new, as in not drilled. So the permit could have been applied for, but refile for permit or whatever. You could essentially squash the small producers out there because the prices aren't high. You couple that with, I think this isn't getting a lot of traction, but we talked about this morning some. The federal minimum wage, raising the minimum wage right now is not what service companies want to hear because they've got to decide: are they going to take reduced profits, or are they going to raise their rates to these oil and gas companies? And oil's not doing that well. So I think we got a lot of little things here that the Biden administration could do that could really hamper it. Aside from that, if they roll out federal regulations on drilling on federal lands that are pretty stringent, you don't think Colorado will try to get that passed in their state?
yeah, I'm sure they would. But I think I mean, this is not going to hurt Exxon. It's not going to hurt the bigger oil companies, even the bigger, because they've got their leases all, stacked up, and it's going to hurt the smaller ones, because the theme of 2020 and apparently 2021 is let's kill small businesses.
Crush the little guy. Just crush him.
Crush him. Crush him.
Okay, let's see here. We got time for a few more. Biden's stimulus may be too big amid economic recovery. Should be targeted at those impacted most. It's almost as if you knew where we were going next with your last comment, Miss Wald.
Yeah, I love this. Now, like, he couldn't propose big enough stimulus, and now they're like, oh, it's too big.
Too
Let's
big.
play the Goldilocks game. So,
Too
what kind of
big.
stimulus is just right? It's the one that helps the people who vote for me the most. I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm so cynical at this point. I'm like probably the most cynical person in the world. So,
Dr. Cynical.
yeah, maybe the stimulus will be targeted at those who need it, as opposed to those who are using their stimulus money to go out and buy Apple Watches. But yeah, don't hold your breath.
Well, the question that I have is, if you're going to cut the stimmies, is like I saw someone that's left on stimmies now. So stimmies, that's such a big word the other day. He goes, "What's a stimmy?" The American thing. Anyways, to your point, so you have people who need the money, obviously, because they've been wrecked because in these shutdowns. Okay, but usually when these bills are passed, there's a disproportionate amount that goes to the big corporations, which is why we're seeing the stock market just continually blow through records, despite the fact that demand numbers aren't down universally, but they're down in a lot of spots. And so, um, I'm a little concerned that even another stimulus might put oil and gas companies in a bad spot too, because let's face it, if you're sitting here right now, and you're an oil and gas company, the price is at 52, 53, whatever it is, and you're looking at ahead, you can hedge a little bit. No one else is calling foul. Why should you? Right?
I mean, why not? I mean, but also, okay, so unemployment they say the unemployment rate is 6.7%. I suspect it's much higher.
On unemployment, unless it's, I'm almost positive it's unemployment. After 2 years, they don't track it anymore.
Yeah,
So it's
exactly. And it also doesn't count anyone who wasn't employed as an employee. So if you were a 1099
right.
or you're an Uber driver or whatever, you're right in the stats. So, okay, so if unemployment, but at a certain point, we're just like, when are we going to worry about inflation? Or do we not worry about that anymore?
Well, when you raise that $15 minimum wage, you're going to find out about inflation, I suspect.
Yeah. Florida just voted to raise the minimum wage in Florida to $15 an hour. But I thought it was like raise the minimum wage to $15 by, like, we're going to get there by 2025.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like tomorrow everyone
right.
has to start paying. It's like over many years.
Well, yeah, so Ben Samuels and I were having this discussion. And I mean, I think it's again, you talk about hurting small businesses versus big companies. If you're McDonald's or ExxonMobil, I mean, I don't know which employees ExxonMobil has, but a big corporation like that, where you have huge departments that have huge budgets that you can just move around. You can skim from here, you can skim from there, and you can increase your base pay to your from $7 to $15. That's one thing. But if you're a small business and your margins are razor thin and you're trying to get it, and you go from $7 to $15, you're passing that cost on to your consumer more than likely.
Right.
And so then it just means that your goods are more expensive, which means that the person from 7 to 15 is not really picking up any benefits. And then what about the people that make from above 7, so the 10 to 20 hour range? So if you're making $16 an hour, which is over twice the minimum wage, and then they move the minimum wage to $15 an hour, aren't you going to want to raise?
Exactly.
So if you go from 16 to 26, then the person making 26 is like, obviously it can't go on forever, but those are some of the problems. So I don't know. I did see, and I don't think you included this. I'm not sure I sent it over to you. I think it's the Saudi sovereign wealth fund thinks they're going to make money on this economy. Did you see?
Oh, this is the funny part of the podcast where the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund thinks that they're going to make how many, like over 1 million jobs? Maybe the PIF could do that on its own just by hiring all those people and paying them, because there have been lots of articles written about how many people they hire who do like nothing, or who do a lot of work and whose ideas they don't take at all.
Yeah.
I mean, like, how many times can I just like say, like, governments don't do a good job of driving economic development, and their PIF's idea is to buy companies.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not actually fostering private business. It's not really, they say it's private business, but then these companies just get bought by the PIF, which is like, so, sorry. Don't get me started. I don't want to go to PIF rant.
Let's see here. One more, I think, before our guest comes on. Iraq's dominance over Indian crude market to be tested if Iran, or Iran return. Now, there was a tweet and over the weekend, and it's funny because I've been waiting for this to be floated out there, and I don't remember which of those. You got those little news Twitter accounts that they're always tweeting out, news, and you never really know if it's real news or not. But I mean, they're usually pretty good, but you don't, they don't always have their source or whatever. But it said something to the fact of, Iran is waiting for Biden to step to the plate. Yeah. Did you see that?
Yeah, and my favorite part, they're all like, Iran, they're just waiting, is now that the Trump is now that Trump's gone and all of the sanctions enforcement is relaxed. I mean, like, guys, how like, you don't relax sanctions enforcement overnight, first of all, and likewise, you don't export oil overnight either. And if you look at some of the work that Tinker Trackers has been doing, they've shown that actually Iran's been exporting like a lot more oil than people have thought. It went down, but it only also like looked like it went down more because they were hiding it. And so, this idea that like suddenly it's going to come roaring back. I mean, I think they were saying they export like 2 million barrels a day anyway. So, I think you can only make these statements if you have the wrong data, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I do think it's interesting. The Indian market, though, I do think is a place to really be to pay attention to, because I think India is growing as an importer, and Iraq does send a lot of oil to India. But what's also interesting is that Iran used to, but there were a lot of spats between Iran and India over developing some shared, I think, offshore gas fields. And so that led to India kind of cutting back on its imports from Iran, even outside of sanctions. So there are a lot of issues other than just bad sanctions to consider here.
Yeah, so here it is. Iran urges the U.S. to act first in returning to the nuclear deal, according to Reuters. That's not from Reuters; it's from some other Twitter account, but they're citing Reuters there. Yeah. So, Joe, we need you to get on that for us and act first. So,
yeah,
I mean, likelihood that we return to the nuclear deal in 2021 is,
I think, is very low. You can't just like step in and step out. I don't know what they're gonna do, but it's not like oh hey, we're back in. It's like saying like we're back into the Paris climate thing. Fine, but like what did it mean anything before? It's not like the Senate ever ratified it like a treaty. It was like, oh, we're back in, everybody clap. Well, are we like what new standards are being enforced as a result? Anything?
Not today.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that the Iran nuclear deal is a bit more significant than that, but I don't think it's like Iran. I mean, Iran has every right to say, like, guys, you can't just jump back in when you feel like it.
So, from Iran's standpoint, they just signed that big deal with China back in September, October. If they're getting around the sanctions, how much would lifting the sanctions really help their business?
Well, I think it would really help them in the business of importing goods that they need,
Right.
because like they need stuff. Like it sucks. The situation there is really, really bad, like humanitarian wise, and especially in terms of medicines. There are avenues for Iran to try to get medicine and stuff outside, that sanctions aren't supposed to deal with, but it's very, very difficult. I think that's probably where you'll see the biggest jump is in those things as opposed to in actual oil exports, because they have been exporting oil furtively to China, and that's probably going to continue. And but if people aren't so scared about incurring the wrath of U.S. sanctions enforcement, I think they'll be more likely to like send medical supplies to Iran. I think
So,
that's probably where you see the first.
yeah, and let me just say this. I'm curious your thoughts. I have long rolled out the theory that the reason that Bitcoin or other cryptos don't get play from nations like Iran is that they understand that if they were to move their currency onto something like that, they would have it opens up Pandora's box for them. It causes more problems. The Biden administration has come in and said that essentially they're going to crack down on Bitcoin as well too, and so that means that they are really trying to hold people that are pegged to the dollar, really to the dollar, and so that's an interesting angle to watch as well.
Yeah, I don't want to give away my entire column for you. My entire
Oh,
Wednesday column
oh,
here,
no, so
but
I didn't know
but
that. Okay,
oh yeah, we
let's
are
go.
gonna we are writing about Bitcoin
All
because
right.
I'll just say this, that it's a really interesting issue, but it's also I think tied to you have to I think it's really important to understand that like what are the things that define a sovereign nation? Okay,
Mhm.
there is basically a monopoly on the use of force. So basically,
Mhm.
like you have a monopoly on the police force. Like
Right.
you're like there's only one legitimate police force, and that's the government's, and minting coins.
Mhm.
So, like, remember how you'd see like old like Alexander the Great put his face on all the coin, and that's intimately tied to sovereignty.
Yeah.
And so, Western countries like, oh, okay, Bitcoin, great, like that's relinquishing your hold on sovereignty.
Oh, yeah.
So you've either got to decide, hey, we're gonna have like national Bitcoin determined by the Treasury, or what. So that's kind of a hint of like the overall idea of where I'm gonna tackle this from. I've actually long thought that Bitcoin actually functions more like a commodity than a currency.
Yeah, so I go back and forth on Bitcoin. I think I have a small position in Bitcoin just for like $100. So when I say small, like it's real. Some people like I got a small position, 300,000. I have like $100 of Bitcoin, and I buy this. I had it for a while just to kind of keep my finger on it. Now I will say this: if someone asked today, if you could go back and do 2020 all over again, what would you do? I would have literally sold everything I had and bought it at like 3,500, and then sold it at 40, and then I would be retired forever. Like when I say everything I have, I mean like literally every. I got a room full of
Yeah.
books here. All would have been gone. Like everything would have been gone. I'd have sold it all in March, and I'll just be retired somewhere right
Did
now.
Did you ever see the movie Hot Tub Time Machine?
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yes,
You know
yes,
how he's like goes back and invents
yes,
frugal? Yeah.
yes,
So
yeah.
yeah, I wish we could all do that. Go back to the
Frugal,
beginning of
frugal.
2020.
Yeah,
Frugal.
yeah. I would have, yeah, been a Bitcoin billionaire, and so I sold 40, bought it for, it'd have been done or whatever it was. So, but I didn't. So I'm still here with you guys, thankfully. For y'all. Anyway, um,
Billionaires can still do podcasts. You can still slum it.
yeah, so can 100 heirs too. So, but anyways, I think the Bitcoin narrative, when you talk to Bitcoiners about what it is and what they think it is and what their hopes are, I think as it becomes more popular, there's going to be a competition in the market space to try to convince the public what it is. So the big banks buying it and stuff, I'm not entirely sold like some people are that that's a good thing for Bitcoin because that big banks getting involved just means more regulation. Like they're gonna, because if their investors lose a bunch of money, then that's a lot different than a bunch of meekly Robinhood traders lose a bunch of money. So I'm a little bit concerned if you're a Bitcoin bull that I think that the Bitcoin bulls, some of them at least, have a over realized confidence of people's resolve to lose money or potentially lose money to the government via taxes or whatever it might be. So I don't know. I look forward to reading on Wednesday on the War Room. And let me say this for our guests coming up. So a couple things we have on. Hopefully this week we'll get it out. Scott Horton, which was talking about all of the overseas wars that the U.S. fights, and so he'll be talking about that. He's got a book got enough already talking about that. And then we also have on Sean Roberts talking about. I'm trying both these out this week. Talking about China's genocide of the Uyghurs, which is getting a lot of attention here in the U.S. So I'm bringing him on to talk about that issue as well. And of course, on Wednesday, Dr. Wall will be gracing us with her presence. So without further ado, though, let's bring on our guest. I think he's ready. Give me a thumbs up if you are ready. We can't hear you, but okay, there we go. So we'll bring him in. Let me see here. How about that? There we go. Professor James Coleman is what it reads on the screen. Right?
Yeah, howdy. Good to see you all.
Good to see you, sir. How's it going?
Good. I obviously need a moniker like Ellen. That's good. I like that.
Okay. Well, it's good to get you on. Why don't you do maybe a quick 30-second intro of who you are and kind of what your background is, and we'll get into it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a professor, a law professor at SMU in Dallas at the law school. I teach oil and gas, energy law, energy transport, and trade. So I really focus a lot on trade and transport of energy, whether it's pipelines, liquefied natural gas, et cetera. My background is I was a biologist, but then I went into law. I practiced law in DC, did a lot of sort of regulatory. That was at the start of the Obama administration, resisting a number of the sort of climate regulations. Our clients wanted to know about that. And then at some point I went and went to Harvard, taught as a lecturer there at the law school for 2 years, and then went to the University of Calgary and I was a professor there at the Law and Business School for 3 years before coming down to SMU.
Well, it's always good to have two doctors on the show because I'm not a doctor. So
I'm not a doctor. You don't have to be a doctor to be a law professor. So don't worry about that. Just got one.
Okay, well, just one doctor on the show. Our favorite doctor, Dr. Energy. Okay, well, we were talking before you got on about kind of a lot that's going on in the legal realm as it pertains to Keystone, the permits, the pushback on federal permitting. So let's start with Keystone XL. Kind of maybe walk us through at a high level. It's been so long, this whole project, that it's kind of hard to keep up with where it started and where it's at now. But the first question I would ask is this the death knell for Keystone? Is there a path around it? And then maybe some things that maybe you've seen commentary that folks have missed the angle on the story.
Well, that's going to depend on what the investors think. I have to think that if, I'm sure the province wasn't looking to put more money into it, but Alberta put a bunch more money into it just last year. So I have to assume that if they were doing that, it was on the verge of death last year. And so, with that said, if you're now looking at another 4 years for approval, I got to think that's going to be really hard. Now, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that President Biden would change his mind on this, but I think it's very unlikely given how clear a campaign promise this has been and one that he's followed through on. If you look at, the reality is 50-50 Senate. Each of those senators has leverage. Senator Tester from Montana there, President Biden's ally, Senator Carper from Delaware, they support the Keystone XL pipeline, but that why would they use their leverage on this? It just seems very unlikely. So I think it's probably dead. We'll see. If you want to know the way I look at it, sort of my take is, look, I became a lawyer in fall 2008, and that's when this application went in. So I've had a whole career basically talking about this single pipeline.
Yeah.
And talk about a long time ago, right? That name Keystone XL, you would never ever in a million years name your project anything XL. That was back in a time when pipelines were so boring that if you were making a multi-billion-dollar investment in pipeline, you wanted everybody to pay attention to it, so you call it XL. Now it's like the Constitution pipeline. Like, who could object to that, right? So that it was a different it was a different time. But if you look at going through that entire, 13 years, I mean, for investors in any kind of energy transport project, wow, what a scary tale. And a lot of the things that have happened in that project have gone on to haunt other projects as well. I think, one sort of really telltale thing is President Trump for 4 years tried to get this pipeline built, and it already had all its environmental analyses. It already had all that, and nothing happened. And look at how different it is. President Biden can come in his first day and kill the pipeline like that. And I think that kind of asymmetry has really been the problem for building energy infrastructure in the United States, which is that a president can't get anything built. I mean, President Obama wanted high-speed rail and clean power lines to take, wind energy to the Midwest, and none of that happened. And President Trump had a number of projects he wanted to build that didn't get built. And, it's a lot easier for presidents to kill projects. And so it'll be interesting because I know President Biden has a number of sort of clean energy infrastructure goals, but it'll be interesting to see if he has any more success than any of his predecessors.
Yeah. Real quick follow-up, Ellen, if you don't mind. So is there a path for Keystone where they sue in federal court to get this overturned? You mentioned some Senate support. What would be what are the support mechanisms that they might put pressure on or try to get this done? Because as a non-lawyer here, to me it feels like it's dead, but I don't know how this might work out in court. So what would be the easiest path to get it done? Just cutting Biden a check and hoping that that works.
Well, your perspective is probably, I would say, is correct, which is to say, as lawyers, we don't usually try to sue our projects through to full completion. That's just usually not a good option to be looking at. It's not impossible. Back in early 2016, TransCanada filed a lawsuit and asked the court in Houston to say basically they don't need a presidential approval because Congress never passed any law. This is done without any law. And so, they said that they could file that lawsuit again, but that is just a real long shot. I mean, I think that argument is plausible, but probably wouldn't win. But even if it did win, there's still all the federal water crossings. And as we saw with the Dakota Access Pipeline at the end of the Obama administration, if the president doesn't want you to build a project, there are a lot of pieces of leverage. Like even if you have all your permits, you might not get an easement. And there are a lot of ways to stop it. So I don't think they'll sue their way to completion. I think the more realistic option is to request damages basically under NAFTA arbitration. Maybe try and get some of your money back. In early 2016, they asked for $15 billion after the second time the pipeline was rejected. Presumably you'd be asking for more now. I think they have a strong claim on its face, but no claim has ever succeeded against the U.S. under NAFTA. So I don't think they'll win that either.
That's that's a really interesting point. What do you have any sense of what the situation is like in Canada in terms of, is there a sense that this is going to help push towards the Trans Mountain pipeline or getting oil from Alberta out to the other coast, or is Alberta really left with no choice but to just ship more on rail?
Well, I think most of the conventional wisdom is they only needed 2 of the 3 pipelines, which is to say line 3, replacement upgrade, right? Trans Mountain expansion and Keystone XL. I think Trans Mountain expansion likely goes ahead because, that the nice thing is within Canada, if it's interprovincial, you just need that federal approval. I think that's probably good to go. And of course, this increases the economic case for it. The second one, line 3, that's a little bit of a wild card. We don't know what the Biden administration thinks about that. There is a consent decree with the government basically agreeing with Enbridge that the line should be replaced. I think some people think, that means the Biden administration won't try to stop that. That to me that wouldn't be giving me a lot of confidence if I was an investor. So I think line 3 still could have some hurdles. But, really, if they get the line 3 replacement and the Trans Mountain expansion, maybe they're okay without Keystone XL.
Let me ask a very simpleton question here, as the non-educated member of the talk show. One of the things that's frustrated me about this process is that private landowners are being prevented from striking deals with publicly traded companies in this case. Is there any argument that landowners could come back and say, "Listen, government, we signed our right of agreement a long time ago. It's been held up. You shouldn't be in the business of preventing me from doing deals with publicly traded companies or private companies, doesn't matter." Is there any kind of litigation we might see from the private landowners who wanted to work with Keystone in this case, to get back at the government? Because essentially, once that right of way is there, you can't build upon it, and if it's being held to be used in the future, then you can't do anything. So they've lost their value of their land over a period of time. Might we see some of those stories trickle out in the future?
Well, that's an interesting question. I hadn't considered it. And the other kind of claim that you might have made is a takings claim, right? Where you say that the federal government just took something of value to me. Mm-hmm. I think in that would be a novel kind of takings claim where you say, well, I thought this project was going to be built, but because of your regulation, you took it away. I feel like it'd be a little bit unlikely to win because, that to the kind of classic takings claim is that the government really literally takes part of your property, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. There's part of it that they take themselves, not because of a contractual decision you made, but they actually just took it from you, right. Or they flooded it, or they did something with it that makes it so that you can't use it anymore. And I think probably what the courts would say is, well, that's the risk you take. That pipeline projects don't all get built, and yeah, this project has been through a lot more, the ringer than the average project, but it's still the normal system that you should be aware of, which is that sometimes projects don't go ahead, just like any real estate development.
So the play might be here is if you had eminent domain exercised on this project by the federal government. Say, no, I didn't want to be a part of it. You guys made me give it over, and then now right. You're giving it back to me, and I couldn't do anything with it for a decade. That might be the best shot someone might have.
Yeah, I think that's true. That could work. And the reality is, one reason people resist eminent domain is because you don't always get compensated what you should have really been compensated for it. And so, that is one difficulty is I think people are often, at least there's a perception, and in many cases, the reality that, people are undercompensated for those government takings.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to switch gears with the time we have left and talk about state energy cartels. Because a while back, Ryan and I were lucky enough to have one of the from the Texas Railroad Commission. We had one of the commissioners from the Texas Railroad Commission come on our show and talk to us a little bit about her reasoning when they were deciding whether to institute prorationing earlier this year. And you wrote a very interesting article about kind of making the case for state energy cartels, and I think our listeners would be really, really interested to hear, what's the gist of the argument, and why do you think this is the way to go?
Yeah, well, so I think in the United States, certainly we're used to thinking we want low energy prices all the time. That's it's been the reality for decades as we've been the world's largest oil importer until China overtook us recently. And but there's sort of been a change, and it's kind of back to the future because the U.S. obviously moving towards being an energy exporter, and it can kind of vary time by time in terms of whether it does that. But certainly for energy exporting states like Texas, there's an interest in high energy prices, right? And that's something that how you deal with that interest is something that Texas really figured out in the 30s, which is that sometimes you want to slow down production a little bit when you have really rock bottom prices. And there's several reasons for that. I mean, one is, of course, it immediately, if you have a little bit higher prices, it immediately increases cash flow to your companies, and that can be very important. It ensures that you get a larger, benefit from those resources, and it also tends to moderate prices, smooth out prices over time, which can have some benefits for people who want to plan on a long-term supply of oil and gas, including consumers, transport companies, etc. Now, obviously, this is strong medicine, and you don't want to do it. You don't want to necessarily do it all the time, but you want to have it in your toolkit. And maybe a classic example of this would be Alberta. So in 2018, Alberta, because it didn't have enough pipelines leaving it at that time, got down to oil prices about $14 a barrel. And those oil prices were so low because that's that Western Canadian Select, which is of course heavy oil and is really diluted bitumen. So you're taking the bitumen from the oil sands and you're mixing it with condensate, and that so if you look at the value of the condensate that they were importing to mix with the bitumen at that time, bitumen prices in Alberta were zero negative at times, and so that means that basically, why do you keep pumping it? Well, a lot of those, particularly those steam-assisted gravity drainage, you can't shut them down. And some of it is vertically integrated, or you're hedged. There's a lot of different reasons. But that basically you had prices around zero for the bitumen. Now, that was intolerable. And so what did they do? Well, they asked everybody in the industry to cut back their production about 8%. I think it was 7.9%. And what happened overnight is that oil prices in Alberta went from $14 to $42 a barrel. So they made everybody cut back. Now, obviously, no individual company wants to cut back, but when everybody cuts back, they cut back, the volume that they're selling 8%. What happened to prices? Well, they went from $14 to $42 overnight. So if you get 300% as much for that oil as you were getting before, even if you have to cut your production by 8%, it's just a huge, huge benefit to your cash flow. And in some ways, that's not surprising, right? Because if you are able to coordinate all the players in a local market that is subject to transport constraints, economic theory would say, if we all cut our production a little bit, the price will rise so much that it will more than compensate us, just as a monopolist would do. The problem with the monopolist is it reduces its production, raises prices, so the monopolist makes more money, bad for the rest of us. So the idea is, are there circumstances where Texas or other U.S. regulators could benefit from this strategy that was so successful in Alberta? And I should say there were some problems with the way it was implemented in Alberta, and we can talk about that. I don't think it was done perfectly there, but in any event, and the reality is yes, because there are transport constraints in the Texas market, not everywhere, right? But if you look at flaring is way down because of the pandemic. It'll be interesting to see whether it comes back with higher oil prices and gas prices inching down a little bit. But when you have those big flaring, that's because there's a transport constraint, right? I mean, it's a lot of reasons people aren't building the gathering lines, but it's hard to build the gathering lines when you're afraid for all your investment, you're going to get it to that Waha hub and you're going to get negative prices or really, really low prices. And so basically the suggestion is that when you have those transport constraints, have a flexible system that can make phase in small cuts. And obviously to do that, you need more information sort of about well by well production. You need one thing that made it work in Alberta, again, there were problems, but one reason it worked as well as it did is that you could trade that. So, if you were, not every company cut 8%. Basically, if you didn't want to cut because you were hedged or other things, you could pay some company to cut more that was in a position to cut more. So and obviously the more information that you have, and especially public information about, production, well by well, the room on pipelines, et cetera, that information could be used by the producers to, cut more or less. The other thing they did in Alberta, and this I think would be important too, is exempted some of the small, really the smallest producers, and I think that would be important. But the idea is, flaring is still a problem, right? But it's definitely less of a problem than it was in February. But you want to develop the capability to address those situations when they arise, because look at natural gas prices in Asia at the turn of the at around New Year's, and it's just crazy the amount that was being flared. And I understand, of course, that the economics of most of those wells are mostly driven by the oil, but it shouldn't. If you could just hold on to that for a little bit, right? I mean, if it was slowed down, if you develop the regulatory infrastructure to do that, you could increase cash flow for the companies, right? You'd have to do it, and you have to do it really carefully, phase in slowly, and see what the impact is. And you could also, save that resource for when it's more valuable, as well as address one of the real black eyes for the industry, which is flaring. And it's not just it's really flaring, venting, and leaking. And of course, all three of those things are driven by rock bottom natural gas prices, right? And the problem is if you just have because what I hear often is like, oh, let's just ban flaring. And I think people have no idea what the negative impact of that would be on oil and gas. I mean, if you're already facing negative prices, and now to actually drill at all, I have to dump all this natural gas and pay anything to get somebody to take it from me. You're talking about spreading negative natural gas prices through the system, right? And every time you do that, that's an incentive for flaring, leaking, venting wherever it's unregulated. I don't think that hammer regulatory approach would work. This is a suggestion of using an alternative that I think could work better for all parties.
So let me ask you this: let's say that you have this state power initiative, the cartel, to use that term.
Yeah.
Could they, in the U.S. legal system, could they actually protect local producers from the federals? And so what I mean is, they come out with the methane emissions like they had on the bombing regulation, and Texas goes, no, sorry, we control the production in this state on private lands. We're not going to abide by that, because the problem I would have with what you're saying is you would have the Texas Railroad Commission trying to monkey with stuff, and then you have the Biden administration monkeying with stuff, and you just crush the small producers because they're getting regulated all across the board. So could these entities protect them from federal regulation?
There's not like a one-to-one protection. I mean, the reality is federal law is supreme. And so if the federal government regulates, you can challenge that under the Clean Air Act and say it's invalid, but that's pretty much your only game in town. However, yes, I do think that in a horse trading sort of way, if the oil producing state said, look, we have this under control and we are taking steps to regulate it, could they delay Biden administration action? Or if they said, look, we're going to act on this as long as you don't, really nail us with any of this new, existing source regulation, some of the things that they're talking about doing under the Clean Air Act. Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be part of a negotiation. Now, the flip side, maybe I'm not sure if this is the question you're asking.
Let me rephrase it for you real quick, just to help it. In Colorado, Washington, they've legalized drugs. Federally, they're illegal. This is not a one-to-one, but I think about those examples going, okay, is there ways that the state could ignore federal regulation if they had something like this? So not a lawyer. I'm just trying to think about the question.
Okay, so it doesn't get you out of the Clean Air Act. But it is true that there is a role for the states in administering the Clean Air Act, and they would be able to use that in all their arguments to say, well, no, we think this is sufficient to regulate this problem. This might be right now, we don't know what the Biden administration is going to do under the Clean Air Act. So it's a little premature to say, sure. I could give you a little bit more of the sort of give and take of how that might, be an alternative mode of compliance with the Clean Air Act. It might be, but it depends on what the Biden administration does. There is a second thing that you might be talking about, which is, federal antitrust law, which does prevent, which normally would say, it says that the oil and gas companies can't come together themselves and do this, right? Mm-hmm. Because it would obviously, if you brought all the oil and gas companies together, first thing Adam Smith said, nobody in the same business comes and meets without forming a conspiracy against the public. Like the first thing they would do if you allowed them to talk, unfettered, is they'd say, okay, everybody slow down production a little bit. We'll all make more money. Mm-hmm. So they're not allowed to do that. If they did that, they'd all go to jail. Federal antitrust law is no joke. Don't mess with it. So, but the thing is, if it's demanded by the state or coordinated by the state, it is allowed. So that is an exemption from the federal law. So they don't have to worry about that if it was done by the states, just as it was done in the 30s.
I got you. Ms. Wald, like the last question to you. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just kind of remembering back to when we were, or at least I was, kind of fascinated by the hearing and the discussion going on at the Texas Railroad Commission, and it seemed like one of the biggest issues that the commissioners were facing was that they didn't know how to actually how they would go about prorationing, because it hadn't been done in so long, and so they were kind of like at a loss, like, well, how would we even do this? And so it's interesting to see that you've kind of laid out almost some guidelines that they could potentially follow if this was the kind of thing that they wanted. I mean, it definitely seemed like they were very much reacting to a really, really bad situation that was probably going to get better on its own. I mean, by the end of the hearing, it basically seemed like companies were going to end up cutting on their own, and as long as we didn't overtop storage in the US, like, we'd bottom out and it would end up being okay, just not good for the present time. But it's an interesting thing. I know the Oklahoma Commission works a bit differently, and they decide something different, and the same with North Dakota. Do you have any kind of comments on those models?
Yeah, so okay, so the problem is a little bit North Dakota. I think North Dakota and Texas are a little bit more of the same problem because of the rapid build out and flaring, right? I mean, that it makes it a little bit more similar model. The thing I would say is there are models, like, look at what Alberta did, both what they did well and their mistakes. And I would say one mistake is that they didn't phase in cuts; they cut too rapidly, and that was a problem for transport, right? Because they basically got rid of the differential, right? And you don't want to get rid of the differential, because the differential is what funds transport markets. So they kind of killed their crude by rail investment, and so it should be done carefully. But so that's Alberta is a good model. I mean, also look at what Texas did before. I think there's lots of ways to improve on what they did, but this was, I mean, and maybe this goes back to Ryan's question. In the past, this was coordinated by the federal government, right? The federal government and the states would get together and kind of figure out, well, how much production should we have? How much, cut should we allow? And there's a unique thing now, which is that had you tried to do this 20 years ago or 30 years ago, who would have flipped out about any suggestion that the states should slow down oil and gas production? It would have been the coasts, right? The coastal energy consumers would have flipped out about any suggestion that gasoline might get a little bit more expensive or anything. And now with climate change, I mean, they probably applaud, right? I mean, like, I think you've got actually there's sort of a confluence of interest, which is a little bit rare there, and provides an advantage. So, but maybe to Ellen, to talk, I mean, they have to, there's no question that they have to build up the regulatory infrastructure to do this, because Alberta didn't really yet have it in place. That's why they did something kind of crude, and why I'm suggesting they could, do it a little bit more gradually. Let me say two more things in response to what you said. I mean, now, because flaring is down, it's still way too high, but flaring is way down, I think is the moment to develop those, more information. I mean, if you look at Texas is a model of energy production and regulation to the whole world, because we're the center of the oil and gas world, and that's true in power production as well. But if you look at power production and our competitive market in power, they have like the best app, real-time information, all this stuff. And the information that the Railroad Commission puts out, by contrast, is embarrassing. I mean, the EIA puts out such great information. U.S. energy statistics are better than anywhere in the world. Alberta's are pretty good, but Texas is like not half, but it's at least a third of U.S. production, right? And so there should be it should have a serious information portal that would, that people are looking for its information. How many was it? 100 countries or 90 countries watching that commission hearing? So they're, the eyes of the world are on Texas, and they should have, we should be showing them something. So I would say that we need to upgrade those parts so that we are able to respond more nimbly in the future. Because, the reality is, if this flaring problem, blows out in certain places, it's not going to be everywhere, right? It wasn't everywhere before. It may be, first it's the Eagle Ford, then it's the Permian, then it's particular places in the Permian. And in each of those, when it gets out of control, rather than having these permit by permit reviews, I mean, some of those cases are crazy, right? Because it's a pipeline company suing the, suing the oil and gas company, saying stop flaring, when in fact the pipeline, the company is, if they deliver gas to the pipeline, they're going to have to pay to have it taken away. And that's just like deciding that on a case by case basis is crazy. Instead, we should have an easier, system to say, like, okay, it's out of control here right now. Everybody here, cut back 2%. We'll see if that handles it. Because when people cut back 2%, that'll trade with which company wants to do it, and it's going to create a little space in the pipeline, and hopefully that'll get it under control. If it doesn't, maybe we need to make it 3%. If it raises prices, maybe we need to make it back up to 1%. So we need to have nimble ability to respond to that when it happens in the future. And I don't, it might in terms of flaring getting out of control, it could be soon again.
Okay, Mr. Coleman, thank you so much. People can find you on Twitter at Energy Prof.
Energy Law Prof.
I'm sorry, Energy Law Prof. Thank you.
Yeah, blog's the same address too. EnergyLawProf.com.
We will link to all of that in the show notes for folks who want to follow your work. Thank you for hopping on with us today. We enjoyed it, and I'm sure we'll be calling you here in a few months to get some. Because we didn't even talk about the thing about the federal permits. So
I'd love to talk about that too, Alan. I liked your tweets about that.
So we'll have to get you back on. Thank you so much for your time today.
Absolutely, great talking with you.
Thanks.
And Ms. Wald, with that, let's go ahead and talk about where you will be this week. Where will you be?
Let's see. This week I will be on the War Room Media column, and is that what we're calling it? Sorry.
Now we can call whatever you listen.
Okay. We'll be on Ryan's Substack, which is really fun, and also on Hot Take of the Day, with a column most likely looking at Bitcoin. So so that should be interesting. And I will also be on investing.com. And then next week, I'm supposed to be on Bloomberg Law, which is a new thing. I have some commentary on a case that was recently argued before the Supreme Court about various localities like Baltimore that are suing oil companies based on state nuisance laws for climate change. Get your head around that.
That's fun. All right. Well, be sure to check out the show notes, and we will link to it again. It's EnergyLawProf, PROF.com, or at EnergyLawProf is our guest Twitter handle. Miss Wald will be back, I guess, next week, right? Yeah, same bat channel. And hope everyone has a good week. Talk to you then.
Bye.